This will be your JPR tutorial for State JPR number 2, starting on the Colorado Division of Fire Prevention and Control website. I've pulled up JPRs. I'm going to scroll down to the hazardous materials section. We're in Hazmat operations. As we mentioned in the review, your JPRs that are listed in gray are also marked mandatory on this side. That means you know going into this test that you will see these. So you'll see emergency decontamination, which we covered in a previous video, and the SDS, safety data sheet. So we'll scroll down to number 2, JPR Hazmat Ops number 2. This is one of those JPRs that seems a lot more involved than it is, but this is all going to be using reference material provided to you and transferred over to an accompanying worksheet attached to this JPR, which will also be provided on test day. This is one of those skill stations that you don't want to overthink. You definitely want to use your understanding of the material taught in class, but you're not necessarily defining these things. You're locating it in the MSDS, transferring it over. The skill is designed to ensure your ability to take basic hazmat information and move it over into a larger plan. The scenario given could be that you're the first arriving ops personnel and you're given a known product provided by the proctor, and you've been tasked with coming up with all the pertinent information. You don't have to necessarily commit any of these to memory because they're all provided for you on this worksheet. You do need to know how to find it. So scrolling back up to our JPR, you're told in the tasks what content you're going to be responsible for finding. These are all listed in your worksheet and broken down. You have 30 minutes to do this, which if you know how to navigate an SDS could take you 20, but plan on this not being a quick 10-minute exercise. This will take some time just by nature of researching the material and transferring it over, writing down a lot of information. You need to get at least 18 of the 23 items correct. Safety fail really isn't a factor in this. You'll do this sitting at a desk with paper and pen. SDS will be provided. It'll be drawn. It'll be a random SDS drawn by your state proctors. So you need to do this in time within that 30 minutes, and you need to accurately present this information, getting at least 18 out of 23 correct. So task steps are broken down for you based off the criteria listed above. I've randomly chosen an SDS form. Just a quick review of SDS. I've drawn crude oil just at random. We haven't reached the point where MSDS sheets or SDS sheets are uniform yet. So the basic breakdowns of these are not necessarily something that's going to be uniform to all SDS forms. You may find information such as components and exposure limits listed somewhere else in another SDS. I would recommend Google searching just an MSDS, do an image search, and you'll see exactly how many different formats are out there. It's okay, all the basic information, if it's applicable, is going to be listed. It just takes a little bit of reading. So I would recommend familiarizing yourself with a few different ones because you may not see this exact layout. But for the sake of this exercise, I've chosen a random one, crude oil, a relatively common commodity, and I'm going to take you through line by line on how to do this. So going back to our JPR, first things they want to know, physical and chemical characteristics. This is all best accomplished by working off of your worksheet, which is going to be provided. So you'll be handed an SDS, such as this one, you'll be handed this worksheet, and then your JPR, but you'll be working off of this worksheet. First thing we want to locate is physical and chemical characteristics. So on any JPR, or excuse me, any MSDS, we're going to have to do some looking. You're not always going to know exactly what page to flip to. You're not always going to know the exact numbered section you're going to be looking at because they could be numbered differently. So I always would recommend taking that first few minutes just to flip through the SDS before you start trying to transfer information over. Just take a look. You don't need to read every line verbatim because you are working within that 30 minutes. But just make yourself familiar with some of the information contained in it, in sections where you might find some of this information so that it cues you when you move into your worksheet. So on the worksheet, physical and chemical characteristics. When we're looking at boiling point, specific gravity, and so forth, flammable range, water solubility, we're looking for numbers. And all it's asking for physical and chemical characteristics, put down a number and then any pertinent information that's listed with it. If something is not applicable, it's likely going to say that in the MSDS. Important thing to remember on this exercise is if it's not listed, if it's truly not in there, or if it's listed as not applicable, listed as either NA or NAP, then simply put that. Don't cost yourself points by overthinking it and trying to inject more information than is available. If it's listed as not applicable or it's not listed at all, there's probably a reason for that. So if you leave it not applicable, you'll get full credit for it. If you try to more or less invent something or inject a new idea into the noted section, you risk losing some points there because you're now putting something that's inaccurate. So if it's NA, leave it NA. If it's blank, leave it blank. But most of these characteristics will be found in the SDSs we find, or that we pull for your exam. So physical properties. We're looking at components here. And then we just read through. I've pulled this at random so that I have to actually go through at the pace that you will on your test day. I purposely didn't pick one that I'm real familiar with. So we want to go through and look for these chemical characteristics. So we can cue to the word chemical description here. We can list it as a hydrocarbon liquid. And then we'll look for anything else that's applicable. So here, this could be listed on as number 1 on another SDS, but in this case it's number 9. So don't get too cued in on the numbers listed on your worksheet. Here we've found a section actually titled Physical and Chemical Properties. You will find this almost without fail on an SDS. It just may take some looking. So we've scrolled down and here we find all the applicable information listed on your worksheet. So we go ahead and just do basic data entry. Transfer it over. If it's listed as NA, just transfer what's written over to that worksheet. You don't need to make any guesses. You don't need to overthink it. Just move that over. If it's not applicable, move it on over. So we'll fill in this whole section using the physical and chemical properties section. Then we'll move on to physical hazards. This will always be listed. You just need to find where it is. So what are the hazards of this material? I like to always go back to the top. Hazard identification. It's highly flammable. Does that fit into our criteria? Well worth listing. So physical hazards of the material. It's highly flammable. Reading through, we just do a quick scan. Avoid breathing vapors or mists. So we know it's an inhalation hazard. That would be worth listing. You're rarely going to find a hazardous material where it's recommended that you swallow it, but never a bad idea to list ingestion. So I would list flammability, inhalation, and ingestion as physical hazards of the material. Additionally, it asks for health hazards. Those may be one and the same. We've listed the immediate hazards, physical hazards, as flammability, inhalation, ingestion, but you may list those here. If it offers some more detail, it never hurts to add more. So here, we'll get to routes of exposure later, but this could be applicable. It'll list things about irritation, symptoms. Signs and symptoms are worth adding. We already know that it's a flammable hazard. And then I always give it one more scan like I'm doing now just to make sure I don't see anything else health related. So we've identified the type of hazard. It'll almost always be identified in a way like this, identifying those hazards. So we'll list our physical hazards, health hazards. Signs and symptoms. We've already kind of found this. But here we find it with the heading, signs and symptoms, under routes of exposure. And then we can go through here, find the pertinent things. You're not expected to transcribe this entire 2 paragraphs over to this sheet, but find all the pertinent information. Don't invent anything, don't get creative with it, just transfer over what's listed. Routes of entry, that's easy because we just saw that. Routes of exposure, we've talked about inhalation, we've talked about eye contact, skin contact, ingestion. List all of these. The more thorough you can be, the better. Again, don't feel like you have to copy this verbatim, but pull out those major signs and symptoms and list those major routes of exposure. If it lists something as a primary, list it in that order, and just to be thorough, list it as inhalation and in parentheses, primary. Just list it exactly how it is here. Because when it comes to grading this, somebody's going to have this information listed on a test key, and they're going to grade directly off of that. And that's taken directly from these JPRs. Permissible exposure limits. These are some industry terms. Something worth noting about MSDS sheets is they're not just for emergency response, they're also there for industry. So this is something that has to be provided in every chemistry lab all the way up to fixed facilities. This will be anywhere where there's potentially some hazmat being stored. It could be just basic chemical products, cleaning products. It may be more hazardous material, but there will always be an SDS sheet posted somewhere. So this isn't necessarily just for emergency responders. A lot of these exposure limits, which you don't need to define here, but you do need to be somewhat familiar with how to find it in your SDS, may be more applicable to industry standards. You'll recognize some of these terms from our operations course, but in this case, we're not necessarily describing what these are, we're just listing the values given on the SDS sheet. So we'll flip through. We're looking for permissible exposure limits, or anything listed as an exposure limit. So we'll see here components and exposure limits. Now this is crude oil, but you'll notice that there are several contents listed. So crude oil, depending on where it's drawn in the country, depending on the concentration, depending on a lot of environmental factors, will not be the same everywhere you go. So that's why with this particular SDS, you're going to see some non-applicables, because there isn't one quantifiable value we can give crude oil. Again, depending on where it's drawn, how much sedimentation is in it, what concentration it's in, this compound may have different values. So you're not going to find just one value for crude oil. But it's listed that it also has these other contents, butane, hexane, and so on. Permissible exposure limit, if it lists a non-applicable, again, just transfer that over. Include these other values in order to be thorough. So list butane, hexane, and put these PELs. But for crude oil in general, it's not applicable. If it does list values for each of these, list those. Again, don't overthink it. Don't invent values. Just list what's there. Manufacturer contact. There will always be the manufacturer of this chemical listed somewhere. Sometimes it takes a little looking. Sometimes it's at the top. Sometimes it's at the bottom. Again, these are not uniform data sheets, unfortunately. Here's manufacturer. In the interest of being thorough and not risking giving up any points on your test, I would list all of this information, at least the company and some contact information. Manufacturer contact. The idea here is if we have a release of this product and we want more information than what's on scene, we have the ability to call the manufacturer directly and talk to them about hazards, about mitigation, and so forth. So moving on, precautions for safe handling, hygiene practices. This section gets into some areas where you may have to do a little bit of looking, or it might jump out right at you. But we're looking for hygiene practices. Again, this can be more applicable to industry than it is to emergency response, but we still need to be able to find it.